Hello, this is a Brave Knight Mercenary spotlight on Edin. Edin is a 5-star warrior. His story is that he and his twin brother Siegmund were training to become paladins of the Arclight Order. However, Edin was born with a curse, which diminished any chances of him joining the Order. Resentful, he exiled himself and came across an evil sword, and decided to do evil things with the evil sword. Edin's companion is Destiny, and she is a homunculus of Edin made by a Twilight alchemist named Alcitine. Alcitine made many homunculus clones of Edin with the hope of trying to copy his memories and the sword he uses. Destiny was the only homunculus who survived the experiment, and she wasn't fully successful either. She didn't recall Edin's memories and developed her own personality as a result. She now seeks Edin, believing that their meeting will fully develop herself. I'll briefly go over Edin's skills, gameplay style, and provide some of my opinions on him. I won't be going over the details of his skills, but just the general parts of it. I linked the Brave Knight's encyclopedia in the video description where you can easily read on his stats and skill values. Edin's first skill is Permanent Curse Barrier. Curse Barrier does multiple things. First and foremost, it's a permanent skill, so it cannot be removed. Second, Curse Barrier provides incoming damage reduction. Third, Curse Barrier applies the curse stats weakening debuff onto his attacker before their normal attack. Fourth, Curse Barrier comes with a demerit where Edin consumes a percentage of his current health after he attacks. This HP penalty actually synergizes with another one of his skills, so it's actually not really a demerit. I'll go more in depth onto that later. At plus 12 and above, Curse Barrier also provides a defense boost. This allows Edin to reach 100% defense on his own with good shield runes. He will also strip any stat enhancements that his attackers have prior to being attacked. Edin's second skill is Full Force Strike. Edin deals additional damage after normal attack that scales with his missing health and attack value. This additional damage ignores defense. The skill synergizes with the health penalty that Edin applies to himself with Curse Barrier. A max skill rank Edin will lose 50% of his life when he attacks for the first time, which means that he deals 225% of his attack value as additional damage. This doesn't factor that the skill can crit and is affected by crit damage modifiers, which leads me to his third skill. Edin's third skill is Lasting Crit Damage Boost. At the start of battle, Edin gets a stat enhancement buff that increases his crit damage by a set amount and further increases it by a small amount every turn. At plus 3 and above, he also gets an attack boost along with a growing attack boost. Because Edin's normal attack and full force strike scales with crit damage and attack, the skills allows Edin to deal a lot of damage as the fight progresses. Also do note, despite not being explicitly mentioned so, this skill is unremovable until it actually expires on its own. The guide takes care to mention that certain skills that activate at the start of battle are unremovable, and this falls under that category. Edin's awakening skill is Permanent Stats Weakening Immunity. Edin is immune to stats weakening such as curses. Edin is a straightforward warrior who hits front and is designated to deal high amounts of defense ignoring damage. Edin is very strong and often does not depend on buffs to kill many units on his own. Edin is mostly designated to take out forms that intend to block with a unit that relies on defense. If an enemy is intending to shield her lane with Levia on the front, Edin could easily take her out. Edin also transitions well into the later rounds where his crit damage and attack reaches very high amounts. Past this point, most units that tank him need a guard to hold him off, as his raw damage tends to be far too high to conventionally tank. Edin can also reach 100% defense by himself. Edin starts off with the base 10% defense, and his curse counter at plus 15 provides him with 35% defense. This leaves him at 45% defense, so you need 2 shield runes to make up for the rest of the 55%. This is doable with good shield runes. Having 100% defense Edin is really useful as he is no longer affected by various counters, which gives him more freedom to wreak havoc. I'll go over what Edin counters. Edin's powerful defense ignoring damage and immunity to curses makes him fantastic for killing units like Levia, Celia, and Cecilia. He can also kill most other units as well: Alec, Dalby, Edin, Nartis, Raphitia, Orfina, Belieth, Valze, Angelica, and many other more fragile units obviously. Past round 2, he may reach enough crit damage and attack to even one-shot Belfern, Granhilder, Cowley, and Banshina. He could reach that threshold easily at round 1 if you choose to buff him. Basically, Edin is one of the kings of raw damage, and there's not much that he cannot kill. I'll go over some Edin counters now. Despite Edin doing a lot of damage, he can still be walled in various ways. Lucius is one of the easiest ways to hold him off. Edin only attacks once, and Lucius doesn't survive by conventional methods. Edin will spend a lot of time being stuck on Lucius unless someone else is there to help take down his death guard. Other guards can also block him, Arcalen and Arcan. Yuri can block him for one turn, but the next turn, she's dead meat. Calarone and Bane can also block him with distortion damage, but it's relative to how much damage that Edin deals. Edin at late game can still kill Bane and Calarone depending on how much damage he does, of course. Bane's Stigma can also kill Edin. Mammonier also presents a huge wall for Edin. Edin cannot generally reach high enough damage early on to pop Mammonier's first shield. Even at round 3, he may not be able to get over that initial hurdle, especially if the Mammonier has near 100,000 HP on a first energy guard. Remember that Mammonier has innate 50% incoming damage reduction, and that Edin's additional damage only ignores defense. It does not ignore incoming damage reduction. Edin also does not carry an attack interference immunity, so he's affected by Glacia's freeze, which also drops his stats considerably. He may not carry enough damage to kill Glacia as a result, and he will be frozen for a very long time. Edin's also affected by the charm counter of Asmode and Dalby, so even if he scores a kill on them, he may end up turning and doing more damage to yourself. Lastly, units like Arcan and Albion can inflict shock onto Edin that makes him unable to attack. DOT is not a common way to kill Edin because DOTs tend to be blocked by 100% defense, but there is one exception, and that is decompositions. Decomposition is a DOT that deals percentage HP over time, but it also comes with a stat drop. This means that Edin's stats can still drop because of the debuff inflicted is categorized as a DOT and not a stats weakening. Kyria is one of the best decomposition units for this specific niche. She can attack Edin, drop his stats down with a decomposition, and let the decomposition kill him afterwards. Edin is very prone to dying to fixed damage counters from Belia skeletons and Seto. Seto is particularly problematic for Edin due to Seto killing him both by being attacked and by attacking Edin. Speaking of units that can kill Edin, anything that ignores defense will do. Alec, Orvina, Susera, Asmode, Levia, you get the idea. Lastly, Celia can cause a huge detriment to Edin. Edin at plus 15 with good runes can barely reach 100% defense. Celia is guaranteed to drop that stat to where it'll be a hole in Edin's defense, which opens a whole new slew of options that could beat him. So some synergies with Edin. Edin works well in most team comps and is fairly self-reliant as far as warriors go. Edin appreciates methods to cover up his lack of attack interference immunity mostly. Raphithia and Serendia can cleanse him of his debuffs, whereas Veronia, Sola can provide him with those immunities. Michaela can increase Edin's stats even further while providing attack interference immunity, but be careful, Michaela is capable of killing her allies with her buff. Edin drops his HP a lot on his own, so he'll generally get to attack twice or 3 times before he dies if Michaela is involved. The additional damage may be worth it, but yeah, just keep that in mind. Because Edin relies on losing life to deal a lot of damage, he has anti-synergy with any healer. Buffing him with Floria and Stella is not a good idea. Galania has nice synergy with Edin because Edin can maintain himself at 1 life if he receives lethal damage. At 1 life, Edin will deal as much damage as he can with full force strike. Edin's offensive partners that he appreciates are generally skip attackers as he clears out the front well on his own. He may need to rely on Alec however to clear guard based roadblocks that he gets stuck on. Edin shares a set bonus with Maria and Frederica that increases attack. You'll almost never use a set bonus. Maria is the 3-star unit that flourishes in Novice Arena, while Frederica is a fairly obscure 4-star unit that is only kinda useful at taking out Cali. Okay, so from my opinion, Edin is a fairly straightforward warrior. He hits front 2 tiles and he deals tons of defense ignoring damage. Not much to say else in terms of that. Edin's raw damage is insanely strong, especially as he begins to lose life and let his crit damage and attack stat build up. While raw damage is very nice, Edin's inability to break through certain guards presents a lot of issues when it comes to Edin's current viability, and even his future viability. Mammonier and Lucius are huge threats to blocking Edin, and there exist other units that can redirect his damage, like Kaelin and Bane. Edin is useful if people are willing to try to tank front with 100% defense units or fairly tanky units that Edin can still burn through. Then late game he can transition to killing tanks like Rand, Bane, and Valtor if he's still alive. However, that situation is hard to come by given that Edin's survivability is at an all-time low with so many units that can bypass defense. Edin's mostly only useful in Guild War and World Arena. He can work well in regular arena, but he will begin to have issues later on. So should you invest in Edin? And my answer is mostly no. Edin is decent overall, but it's hard to justify building him due to how he's obtained. Edin is a mileage character, and mileage sucks fat juicy steaks. For the uninformed, Edin's only obtained through gambling and a mileage summon, and you have a 10% chance of obtaining him. Getting enough mileage points to roll for him is an ordeal in itself, and you have to spend considerable amounts of diamonds just to reach the 4,000 mileage points to roll him. Fortunately, and I put fortunately in quotes, you can get him guaranteed on the 10th try if you didn't obtain him yet. Before this pity system was put in place, I heard horror stories of people throwing away seas of money just to never get him. He's definitely not a very free to play friendly character. Fortunately, he's not a necessary character. Alec is obtainable for free and does Edin's job far better for the most part. Alec doesn't have 100% defense or stats weakening immunity, but it's well worth giving those away to deal direct damage. Alec is a legend of course, so that comparison isn't completely fair since you also have to roll for a few of his legend companions, which is kind of a crappy ordeal in itself. Basically, Edin is kind of a bitch to obtain, and you definitely don't need him. If you have him, you can throw a few skill books onto him if you feel like it, sure, but I argue that Susera and Orfina are far more useful in terms of defense ignoring characters, and Susera is free, while Orfina is a conventional 5-star that you can select to roll for. So yeah, long story short, I don't recommend Edin for players who don't have him yet, and even for those who have him, then sure he could be built up, but he still will be overshadowed by certain other characters in higher tiers in regular arena where people can run Alec instead or run Orfina. He may see some use in World Arena due to the legend limit, but every release of a new guard unit hurts his viability more. In terms of what skills I would recommend him to be at, plus 10 is where he gets his 2 tiles, which makes him a lot more useful because 1 tile Edin kind of sucks. Plus 15 is the next hurdle that matters because that's where you can reach 100% defense on his own. Plus 12 and beyond can help, but it's hard to reach 100% defense from those skill levels. Plus 15 is where it really matters. Edin is not a cheap unit. Anyways, overall, Edin was a very popular and strong unit back then that has slowly been shifted out due to the abundance of ways he can die and the ways he can be tanked. Guard units are the bane of Edin, and there's quite many of them now. Not to mention the plethora of fixed, defense ignoring, and direct damage that exists in the game. Edin gets a big pass from me, and good riddance too. Mileage is a very whack system. If you like Edin or Destiny though aesthetically, don't let me stop you from trying to get him. Just say I didn't warn you. Better prepare that credit card of yours though if you really do want him, because you're going to definitely need it. Thanks for watching my Edin Mercenary Spotlight. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video or found it helpful. I'll try to produce more content in the future. Thanks.